Off my time, but without further ado, I'd like to introduce Julio Shiling, who will give his presentation. Thank you. All right.
Change the venue. Thank you, Sirley, for your testimony. And I want to thank the victims of the Cuba Memorial Foundation for this invitation and for the great work that they do. I want to thank Drs. Omar and Josefina Bento of the Cuba Decide campaign, of which I am honored to be an advisor to. This is a civic program that's designed to give the Cuban people a choice in their future. And I send the greetings of Rosa Maria Payá, who is in the Dominican Republic in an OAS meeting. I thank you for taking the time to be here, and above all, I thank God for this great opportunity. I have the awesome task in limited time to talk about a free and democratic Cuba, the requisites. There are two elements that are vital for a democratization process, of course, after liberation. The first is dealing with the past, and the second is building democratic institutions for true regime change. 1989 was a very big year. In November, the Berlin Wall fell, and with it, it was the emblematic downfall of Soviet communism. I didn't say communism, I said Soviet communism. However, upon empirical scrutiny, 5 months earlier, in the biggest public square in the world, in Tiananmen, 3,000 people were butchered. And in that occurrence, in effect, Asian communism, the China model, this innovative, not really new system, because Lenin tried it in 1921 with his new economic policy, but the Chinese, in effect, perfected this system where you had a mercantile economy with market mechanisms and a Leninist state. This, in effect, crippled the hindsight of many people. Why? Because what had traditionally been marked, the free enterprise system, capitalism, as siding with democracy and centrally planned economies, siding with communist totalitarian dictatorships, all of a sudden blurred. This caused enormous confusion among Democrats of the world, unfortunately, and its ensuing moral relativism. The fascists, though, they had it right all along on this. In other words, they knew that property in private hands with a state that in essence dominated it would be much more efficient. Well, the socialism with Chinese characteristics, in effect, building on the pragmatic side of Marxism, in effect has done exactly that. But what we also saw from 1989 was despotism that competes in elections. We saw refurbished Marxists change names, change identities, but rule with coexistence of private property, but with the state having the ability to, in effect, determine the outcome of who wins and who loses. Some call this Putinism, in the sense that Putin's dictatorship has, in effect, served as a model for this. In 1991, there were 21 states that officially divorced themselves from communist rule. 28. 13 years later, only 8 were full-fledged democracies. What happened? I mean, there were high expectations in 1989. What went wrong? Well, if we look at empirical evidence, and we can point to, for example, the work of political scientist Samuel Huntington, who claimed that there were waves historically of democratization. Waves like, you know, we've all seen them and see it. They come, and then there's a reflux, there's an ebb that pulls it back. In essence, reversing democratic achievements. These waves continued, you know, throughout different sessions. And there were many reasons as to, you know, people trying to explain, well, you know, why do some fail and some don't. Others in the social sciences developed the notion of the modernization theory that they called it. Seymour Martin Lipset, you know, did great work on that, which in effect said, well, you know, if you modernize a society, democracy's got to come. The notion is that as the economy expands, the economic class, the entrepreneurial class will put pressure on the political class to go into the sea of democracy. But the problem with that is that it completely misreads the qualitative difference in dictatorships from what is classically known as an authoritarian dictatorship and a totalitarian dictatorship. They're worlds apart. In regimes of total domination, civil society does not exist. So the theory of modernization is a moot point because there is no civil society. So who's going to put pressure on the political class if there is no entrepreneurial class that is not associated with a political power? And when we rightly look at the successful cases of democratization, we see Taiwan, we see South Korea, we see Greece, we see Brazil. All these were authoritarian dictatorships. Then when we see the same model applied to totalitarian regimes, we see China, we see Vietnam, we see Laos. We see a dictatorship that is more strong than before, and a complicity of its society to a great degree because undoubtedly there is material betterment, and the choice between, you know, living in dire misery and not being able to express yourself, or living better and not being able to express yourself, well, you know, it's an obvious choice. In the case of Cuba, what should be the requisites in a short time? Definitely, the economic order is of secondary importance. A little more state intervention, a little less state intervention. The importance, primacy lies in the political and the ethical system. And this has been, to a great degree, the problem which regimes such as the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Cuban, and what we have in Russia, and what we see in many parts of the world, is that the economy and the commercial interest, which, you know, has been exposed before in this panel, in effect forms a collusion with a political power that can offer certain stability, and democratic ethics goes out the window. And this is extremely, extremely dangerous. So for Cuba, the focus should be, as is the case for any country that wants to transition to democracy, focus on the political and the ethical. That's why this détente with the Castro regime is utterly meaningless if the purpose is democracy. Cuba will be free, however, but it will be in spite of the intentions of the Obama administration. There needs to be a systemic demolition. To be precise, decommunization. And there need to be laws that protect the nation of Cuba from parties and movements that are anti-system. This has worked fine in Europe. I mean, you know, the Europeans have not been shy to put laws in the books that will keep Nazism out of the reach of power, and this makes perfect sense. As John Adams said, democracy is not a suicide pact. There's no reason that anti-system movements and parties should is absolutely pointless and dangerous, because democracy has to be defended. To be even more precise, in the Cuban context, there needs to be transitional justice. If there is no transitional justice, there can be no democratization. We have the evidence in Central and Eastern Europe that will validate this. Transitional justice is not wild vengeance. It is designed to avoid impunity, because if you know that you can commit a crime and not be held accountable for it, it will be repeated down the road. So to avoid this, impunity cannot be tolerated, as it was not tolerated in Europe after the collapse of fascism. Transitional justice requires 1, the identification of the crime, 2, punishment for the criminals, and 3, reparations for its victims. As part of the comprehensive decommunization that Cuba would need, its institutions need to be put away. Hannah Arendt explained very lucidly that the success of totalitarian regimes is in its ability to organize political power in society. The system is maintained by a host of institutions, mass organizations, labor organizations, an array of, in effect, arms of the dictatorial state that try to mimic a civil society, but in effect are just instruments of the political power. This list needs to be dismantled. The regime has enormous businesses outside the territory of Cuba, which has in effect siphoned money away from the Cuban people. These needs to be investigated. These assets need to be found. This cannot be understated because, again, impunity cannot be tolerated, and all these companies, I mean, just recently, the known as the Panama Papers, continue to reveal to the extent that a criminal regime like the Cuban goes to, in order not just to survive, but to profit, because the notion of equality is completely hypocritical, as as we all know, and as the higher leadership of the Cuban regime demonstrates. There needs to be an establishment of an indemnification fund, because victims have to be indemnified. Sirley has to be indemnified. So many others. People whose property was stolen need to be indemnified. Now, I want to be clear, no one should be taken out of their house if they're currently there. However, we cannot sanction what is in effect the biggest robbery of American property in the world. And not just because it's American property, but because it's wrong. So to the extent that this indemnification fund can afford it, this must be done, because again, we cannot sanction theft. There are certain particularities in the ugliness of Cuban communism that so often misses the radar of many of the brightest that are on the side of liberty. Cuba's nature is all-encompassing and has played an enormous role throughout its history in keeping communism well and alive. The notion of the new left, this was essentially fathered by Cuba, where you had the Soviet Union looking at the proletariat, the working man as the agent of change, and the Chinese, well, they had the peasant as the agent of change. The Cuban Revolution, in effect, said, no, anybody as long as they share these sentiments, intellectual, so forth, it opened the door to agents of change, which in effect attracted an enormous amount of people into this movement. Communist Cuba has been the base for the class war struggle in Latin America, has been and continues to be. Communist Cuba has been the bridge with radical Islam. This marriage that you see of convenience between atheist communism and radicalism, it was Cuba that opened the door. Enjoying meetings with Ayatollah Khomeini years before he was in power, while he was still in Paris. The decolonization effort in Africa. Cuba managed to penetrate all these independence movements and attract them towards the communist sphere. When Soviet communism collapsed, Cuba's response was the Sao Paulo Forum, and in effect, bringing together the movements of the left and changing strategy, adopting Antonio Gramsci's superior system, because it must be said, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, his biggest disagreement with orthodox Marxists was, he said economics is not primacy, culture is. Let's focus on impacting culture and penetrate the democratic institutions, and we'll get to power that way. Well, this is what the Sao Paulo Forum was all about. In effect, invigorating communist subversion with different methodology. The so-called socialism of the 19th century is in effect that in motion. You cannot speak today about Venezuela, about Nicaragua, about Ecuador, about Bolivia, about Brazil, without understanding the part that communist Cuba plays. Venezuela is a Cuban colony. So it is important not just for the people of Cuba that Cuba take the correct road and implement this decommunization. It is important that all this information in a free Cuba be not just made public, but the criminal activity of all those accomplices outside of Cuba's borders. There are victims of Cuban communism all over the globe. It's no secret, American POWs that were tortured and killed by Cubans, that were taken back to Cuba because they were in such a horrific state that they could not be returned when the Paris Peace Accords took place. In closing, I cannot understate the importance that if we want to truly conclude the global recession and promote democratic recovery, Cuban communism must be completely demolished and overhauled and transitioned to democracy. It is not just an island 90 miles from here that has a disagreement with the U.S. government. It truly is a focus of evil that impacts the world. And Victims of Communism is an important organization that I think has a great role in this, because the promotion of amnesia is what the defenders and the apologists for these regimes want to promote. I commend the work that you do, and I think that not just looking at the systems that remain, but the subversion that is still waiting to occur if this is not stopped with time. Thank you so much, and God bless.